And we are back. It has been a moment or two, but we are going to continue with the Julio-Claudians, starting with the infamous Caligula. And we will, at this setting, take the Roman emperors down to Vespasian and the Flavian dynasty, at which place we will take another break. And I think that is really all we're going to do for the history portion of the introduction to Roman Civ. Just to let you know, the plan is there will be one more lecture that will be taped. It's really just for your information so that you get the rest of the historical story. It is not something that's going to be taped. It's not something that's going to be tested on the midterm for sure, or any other time. It's just my obligation to you as students to provide you with the full historical narrative. That will be coming much later, I'm afraid. But right now, let's do the business at hand, which is we left off with the death of Tiberius and a rather weak succession plan, where just towards the end of his life, he started to make some feeble efforts. That might be critical, but it's true, feeble efforts to introduce Caligula, his heir, into the public sphere, into the Senate. Caligula is the first emperor who was born after the birth of Christ, born August 31 in 12 CE, adopted in 35. So he was only adopted 2 years before Tiberius died, hence not very much chance to prepare him for his new role. And it showed. Interesting here, a little tidbit, is that his name does not change, unlike Tiberius or Octavian, because when Tiberius became Augustus's heir apparent, he had to adopt Germanicus in turn, which meant that Caligula's father was Germanicus Julius Caesar. So he already had the Julius Caesar name when Caligula was born. So Caligula was born to the name Julius Caesar rather than being adopted to it. It's an interesting little tidbit there. Anyway, he has the usual run of titles. He's the chief priest. He has tribunician power. A number of spouses, because we do this when we are creating alliances with major families. Unlike Tiberius, who flaunted the fact that he was loyal to the memory of Augustus and that he was going to do what Augustus did, Caligula very much broke with Tiberius, which tells us more about Tiberius than it does about Caligula. This isn't Caligula's idiosyncrasy. This is more about the fact that Tiberius was rather less beloved when he died than Augustus had been when Augustus died. Like I say, he did little to advance Caligula. That may have been part of it as well. But when when Tiberius died, Caligula was ratified by the Senate, and they invested him with all the rights and powers to decide affairs, even at his fairly young age. What we see in the coinage is that Caligula made a great show of splitting with Tiberius. So this coin here, you can see he describes himself as Caesar Augustus Germanicus, more plugging into his own natural father than to his adopted father, that he was chief priest, that he had tribunician power. He does not talk about being the son of Tiberius. The other side of the coin is even more interesting, and that is that he emphasizes the fact that he is working within the traditional framework. He's got SPQR, the Senate and people of Rome. More to the point, he is described as being the father of his country, and he is father of his country for having saved the citizens. So really, he is saying that the citizens were living under a tyranny, that they were virtual slaves under Tiberius, and that he has rescued them from that. Not a surprise, Tiberius is not going to be deified. He does not leave a strong enough or more positive enough legacy for that. So very strong split right off the bat with Caligula. In general, the tradition is extremely hostile to Caligula. The historians all hated him. The biographer Suetonius tells us at one point when he's describing the life of Caligula, I have described the man, I shall now describe the monster, because Caligula actually did have a fairly promising start. Things seemed to go along very well. He made great efforts to fix the relationship between the princeps and the Senate, which had deteriorated very badly under Tiberius. He wasn't going to have treason trials, for instance. He burnt Tiberius's papers, which had all kinds of accusations. However, as time went on, he started to reintroduce these things. The other thing, one thing that happened is that halfway through his reign, Caligula got very ill. It kind of reminds us of Augustus. Augustus was extremely ill in 23 BC and was motivated to work on the succession. Caligula became very ill. He recovered, and from then on, as far as the tradition goes, he was a changed man. We don't know if the illness really did have a profound effect on his psyche and on his mental health. The Romans saw it that way because they could not believe that a person could change or evolve, that their personality could change. It's locked in. It never changes. And so for someone to be reasonable and then all of a sudden to be what the senatorial class considered unreasonable meant that either he was hiding his true nature and then it came out, or that this illness somehow affected him. Anyway, there's lots of rumors, lots of strange stories about how he had the army lash the seas in order for him to punish Neptune. Suetonius tells us the story that he was planning on making his horse Incitatus a consul. This is how rumors start, by the way, because Suetonius actually says, there is this rumor that I absolutely do not believe. And he tells us the rumor about the plan to make Incitatus a consul. People don't remember the introduction to that rumor, which is, I do not believe it. They just remember the rumor. And I'm sure that some of you fall into that category. Anyway, always be careful. Always go to the original source for that reason. Anyway, the real issue is that he seems to have alienated the military, especially the military that were stationed in Rome, but just in general. He alienated the military. And so January the 24th, 41 CE, less than 4 years after he became the princeps, two officers of the Praetorian Guard, which is the army unit that is stationed at Rome, assassinated Caligula. Here's just a different form of art that we have. and that is a cameo which shows Caligula and a personification of Rome. I point this out because it's showing Caligula as a divine figure. And that's one of the concerns that the Senate had, was that he was presenting himself more as a divinity than as a mortal, something that Augustus avoided, like the plague. Now, Caligula's been assassinated, seemingly with no plans at all. It was just members of the Praetorian Guard who went rogue, um, and just couldn't stand Caligula anymore. And we get to Claudius, and we're going to see that this is one of the more fascinating transitions of power that you're going to come across. First of all, the little synopsis on Claudius. He is the last emperor who was born before the birth of Christ, 10 BCE. I've put adopted never in caps because he was never adopted. So he is not the designated heir of Caligula. Caligula was quite young. He was not making succession plans at that tender age. But he takes the usual titles of chief priest, having tribunician power. I mentioned two of his wives, Messalina and Agrippina, because they figure very prominently in the Claudius story. He's emperor for 14 years, despite the fact that he becomes emperor at a relatively advanced age, kind of like Tiberius. So the transition from Caligula to Claudius is a fascinating story. Like I said, Caligula had made no succession plans. So upon his assassination, with no plan in place, you would expect chaos, power vacuum. You would expect a number of individuals who think, you know what, I'm pretty prominent. I have Senate support, or more importantly, I have army support. I think I should be the ruler of the Roman thing. We're going to see in 68 that, in fact, 4 people come forward. And there is a very messy civil war that ensues. That's what you'd expect to happen. No, not in this case. We do get a contemporary source, somebody who lived this event, who says that the Senate debated restoring the Republic. So not having a princeps anymore, but going back to the good old days when the Senate looked after things, had the consuls. We're hearkening back 100 years to the days of Cicero, for instance. But that's not what happened. In fact, the story goes, and one of the versions that we have is, you're not going to believe this, but that the Praetorian Guard, with Caligula assassinated, were going through the home of the Caesars, the Caesar family home, and killing and ransacking. So they killed Caligula's wife, they killed his child. They found Claudius hiding behind a curtain. And we get an artistic rendition of that here. Cowering away. He's afraid that he's going to get killed along with the rest of the imperial family. And the Praetorian officer, rather than killing him, says, "Oh, look at this. We found old Uncle Claudius." And instead, they take him to the Praetorian camp and they proclaim him imperator. So, in other words, they proclaim that he is going to be the next ruler of Rome. The story that one historian tells us is that when people in the street saw Claudius being carried off in a litter to the Praetorian camp, that they felt sorry for him because they thought that he was being carried off to be killed. And the way that story goes is that he kind of looked kind of scared and worried. After a single day's negotiation between the senior officer of the Praetorian Guard and the Senate, Claudius was recognized as the emperor. And there were, according to the story, 3 senators went to the Praetorian camp and they negotiated with Claudius. They took back what he said, which was that, I don't really want to do this, but I'm kind of being forced into it. And this is probably going to be the best solution for everyone. And it was accepted. That's shocking that somebody who the day before all this was going on was living his normal kind of behind the scenes life as a member of the family of the Princaps, but not expecting to do anything interesting at all the next day or two, suddenly he's proclaimed Princeps, proclaimed the ruler of the Roman thing. Does suggest that there was a bit of planning that happened before this, that the senators, it's hard to imagine this could just have happened so effortlessly, so smoothly in a day without some planning going on, without Claudius being aware, without some senators being aware that this was going to happen. Anyway, Claudius, whatever the reality was, in a single day we went from Caligula to Claudius. Claudius was recognized as the Augustus, as the Princeps. He is the first Princeps who is not a Caesar. He's a Claudian, but he is not a Caesar. If we look at the legal part of this, when Caligula died, the head of the house would have been Claudius. So he would have become the head of the household, the head of the familia. He would also have become the owner of all the estates, all the lands, all the stuff that the family had. And as I've mentioned before, the Julio-Claudian family's holdings are so massive that you almost can't not be the ruler when you have all that stuff. If someone else is the ruler, they're going to have to deal with you. Either by making you a partner or by confiscating everything and killing you. So to me, that has a major influence in all of this, is that he is the head of the family now, even though he's not a Caesar. But it is the first person who's an emperor who does not have Julius Caesar in their name at all. Anyway, we would expect that somebody who becomes an emperor basically from a coup d'etat would be kind of quiet about that. They would emphasize, as Caligula did, the Senate and the people of Rome. Claudius doesn't do this. Claudius, who has a very unmilitary background, Tiberius was a general and had led troops for decades. Claudius had no military experience whatsoever, and perhaps he was aware of the fact that he needed some kind of military juice. So 4 years after he is made emperor because of the Praetorian Guard, he's still boasting about that. He's still advertising the fact that, and this coin shows it, that he was proclaimed imperator, received by the Praetorian Guard. So he recognizes that it is the military upon which his power is based. He does need to get along with the Senate. He does need to make sure that the people of Rome are reasonably content, because you want to have that stability if you want to have a reign that lasts longer than 4 years, Caligula. But he knows what side of the bread is buttered and who's buttering it. As a young man, just going back, filling in the backstory of Claudius. As a young man, Claudius did not take part in public life at all. We know he had health issues, and they're the sort of health issues, whatever the diagnosis is, that made him appear mentally incompetent as far as Roman judgment was concerned. So what he actually suffered from, whether he really did have like learning disabilities, whether he had mental health issues, physical health issues, is not really relevant. It's what the Romans perceived. And it was difficult for Augustus to figure out what to do with Claudius because sometimes he was very competent. He could get up, he could make a public speech, as he occasionally had to do. He's like, wow, he's not a fool at all. He's mentally totally there, and he writes a pretty good speech. And then other times he would be drooling and stammering and seemed mentally deficient. So ultimately, Augustus decided that he would not allow Claudius to have a public career. He was not going to be in the Senate. And the main reason why was because he might become an embarrassment to the family. And that's actually stated by Augustus, is quoted as stating that. So Claudius was just kind of left to himself to do whatever he wanted to do as long as he didn't embarrass the family. He spent a lot of time eating. He spent time gambling. And he spent a lot of time writing. Tiberius also did have sort of an active mind in terms of, he used to talk to philosophers and talk to particularly people who studied myth. Claudius did a tremendous amount of writing. He wrote about the Etruscan language. He wrote a book about gambling. He wrote a book about the Punic Wars. So a very wide-ranging kind of polymath individual. Certainly not someone who comes across as mentally deficient. He did eventually get into the Senate, and it's kind of like Caligula. It was just at the last minute. Caligula made Claudius a consul. It's often portrayed he did it as a gag, that it wasn't a serious appointment, but it likely was because Claudius was his uncle, was the brother of Germanicus, and a lot of the popularity of Caligula rested with the fact that his father was Germanicus. And so he wanted to remind people of that. And promoting the brother of Germanicus, my uncle, is another way to remind people of that family connection. Anyway, however, he was extremely inexperienced when he became Augustus. Yeah, there we have I, Claudius. It's a book well worth reading. There's a series that's worth watching as well, even though it was done back in the 70s. Claudius did a pretty good job as Augustus. There were a couple of revolts out in the provinces where there was either an army or their leader who thought maybe I could be a better emperor than Claudius. However, they got little support. They did spook Claudius a bit, but generally speaking, they didn't have much support. They fizzled out fairly easily and fairly quickly. There was no civil war. There was no great battle. It just sort of died a natural death because there wasn't enough support for that action. The assessment of Claudius's reign, which you can see is 14 years, is that he was, generally speaking, competent. A little bit difficult to assess because he was not all good or all bad, but that he was very much easily led by his wives and his freedmen, and that he tended to make eccentric rulings because he loved to be the judge at trials. However, he was fairly effective. The fact that he ruled for 14 years, from the age of 48. He's described as having building programs that were important rather than numerous. And I'll just quickly tell you what they were, just to give you an idea of what his infrastructure projects were. It was not like Augustus of, I'm going to found Rome as a city of brick and leave it a city of marble. Claudius's major projects, one of the were much more pragmatic. So one of them was draining the Fucine Lake, which was a lake to the north and east of Rome. It had been troublesome for a while. Seasonal floods made it difficult to live near. And by doing this, and it was quite a massive project which involved tunneling through a mountain, he created a great deal of arable land, which is clearly the purpose of that is to deal with food insecurity in Rome, because you have a city that has so many people that requires so much grain every day to feed the people. This is one way to deal with that locally so that you don't have to import as much grain from the provinces. The second thing that he did was he made a massive expansion of the port of Ostia. And in general, it helps shipping. But again, it's particularly grain. So again, he's dealing with the issue of food insecurity. And Trajan will later on do another expansion of the port. But this is it. It's a very pragmatic task. The third accomplishment that he had, which is one that stands out a little more, is the conquering of Britain. And not only conquering Britain, but adding it as a province. Somebody wrote a glowing poem about how wonderful Claudius was, and particularly praising him for extending Roman control, not just in this world, but he has gone beyond the bounds of the earth. He's gone beyond the river ocean, English Channel, and has extended Rome. It's almost like he's gone into outer space. That's kind of how the ancients would see that he's crossed the great river ocean, and he's taken Rome that far out. Some commemoration of that. We have a coin here. It's got over the Britons is what it says on the right-hand side, and then his own title, Tiberius Claudius Caesar Augustus. The other side here, we have a personification. This is actually from Africa, and it's from a sculpture. It's showing Claudius, who's about to kill the personification of Britain, showing his dominance and defeat of that island. Although Claudius's reign was, generally speaking, relatively stable, in 47 there was some problems. We don't know exactly what happened, but they involved his wife Messalina and a prominent member of the Senate. So whether there was a conspiracy to overthrow Claudius or whether there was just a perception of that, the senator was gotten rid of. Messalina was killed. And that instability made Claudius feel that he needed to solidify his position. What he did as a result was that he married his niece, Agrippina the Younger, and adopted her son, Nero. He's got his own son. Britannicus is his own natural-born son by Messalina. But the fact that Messalina was disgraced to the point that she had to be gotten rid of would not have made Britannicus a particularly good choice as a successor. It would destabilize him. They had to actually create special law just so that Claudius could marry Agrippina the Younger. But there was no intention at this stage that Claudius was going to have children with Agrippina the Younger. The point is, for having Agrippina the Younger, is that her son Nero is a direct descendant of Germanicus. And we have this long shadow of Germanicus. He's still looked upon with in glowing terms, in glowing thoughts, through rose-colored glasses. What he's really doing is he wants Nero to be his successor. And Nero is the direct descendant of Germanicus. In fact, he focuses more in his propaganda on the fact that Agrippina the Younger is his niece and he's sort of taking her under his wing rather than it's a marriage of partners. It also creates a fair bit of stability, not just because he's working on succession, but Nero is very young. It's going to be a long time before he's ready to be able to step into the role of princeps. And it will give Claudius a great amount of time to do that preparation and allow him to have a stable role for a number of years to come. There's Agrippina and Claudius. I have to point out, Claudius is naked there again, kind of portraying himself in divine, similar to the way you portray a god. He's not portraying himself as a god, but it's like he's dressing up like one, or in this case, not dressing up like one. And here we have a coin produced by Claudius, which has Nero on the flip side. So clearly, very closely associating the two as part of the providing for the succession of Nero. 6 years later, Claudius dies from eating either poisoned or poisonous mushrooms. It depends on who you want to listen to. The ancient sources generally agree that he was poisoned, that Agrippina was worried that Claudius was about to change his mind and to start promoting Britannicus over Nero, and that he would have Britannicus as his successor rather than Nero. I argue, I've actually written an article about this, I argue that that's not true. There is no evidence whatsoever that Claudius had this in his mind. All of his actions were promoting Nero. He did that consistently right up to the day he died. He only ever promoted Nero. And we actually have stories of people who ate mushrooms accidentally that were poisonous because they got them mixed up with the proper non-poisonous ones that they really meant to eat. So we know that this could happen in the ancient world as well. And the other thing is that Nero is actually too young yet. He's only 17. In fact, he's actually 16. He's being groomed. He's being prepared to become the princeps. He still has a number of years left in his training. And I would say that everyone involved in this is still on board for Nero becoming the next princeps, and knowing that this is still going to take a few more years of development. There's still some more training left to do. So I would actually argue that Agrippina and Nero were totally not prepared for Claudius's demise. And there is actually the historians concede that a little bit because they delayed the announcement of Claudius's death, according to the story, so they could prepare the Senate and they could prepare things. Well, if they'd actually killed him, if they'd actually poisoned him, they would have prepared things. So to me, that again argues that this was a totally unexpected, accidental death. And however way you want to look at it, we do get Nero, um, who was born CE, adopted in 48, as I say, and was the emperor actually from 54 to 68. The usual titles, several spouses in his young age, and an untimely death in the middle of 68. So Nero is proclaimed by the Senate. They acknowledge him as the Augustus, uh, pretty much right as soon as Claudius dies. At the same time, they proclaim that Claudius is divine. So right there is a pretty good indication that there's a general sense that Claudius did a good job as the emperor. Um, and we're going to see this now becoming the pattern. If you do a good job as emperor, you will be voted divine honors. It's kind of like the final thumbs up on your job. Your successor likely is highly motivated, particularly if the succession is a smooth one, if they are the adopted son or the actual son of the emperor. They want to be able to say, I'm the son of a divine. They can only do that if the previous emperor gets divine honors. Like I say, for about 6 years, Nero had been promoted towards becoming Augustus. He'd made speeches in the Senate. He was appointed the leader of the youth. However, not quite 17 and not quite ready. At the beginning of his rule, the historical record assesses it as he was very young and he was very much guided by a senator who had been his tutor, Seneca, as well as by the head of the Praetorian Guard, Afranius Burrus, and that for about 5 years, things went quite well because these guys were in charge. The consensus is that the more Nero began to exercise power in his own right, to start becoming more involved in the decision-making process, Seneca and Burrus kind of become less influential. They both die. Burrus dies of natural causes. Seneca is eventually forced to commit suicide. And from that point on, we get what historians feel is the unfiltered real Nero, and that he's awful. Interesting to note, we often say that we only hear the senatorial version of the story, that we don't get to hear what the people think. Here's one case where we kind of do get a sneak peek. The people liked Nero. The average person in the street thought he was good. The average person in the empire liked Nero. But the Senate did not like him, and neither did the army, because he tended to ignore he didn't try to build any relationship with the army. He didn't try to even create a military reputation for himself, as Claudius had done. There, by the way, that's what Seneca, his tutor and mentor, looked like. So Nero's basically infamous, right? He's infamous because he ordered the death of his own mother, Agrippina, because he found her to be trying to control him. Again, that's the story. But again, it's also that the Romans feel very sensitive about women being close to power and trying to control it. Probably the most famous thing that comes down to us is that Nero fiddled while Rome burned. And we even still have the expression fiddling around, which means dithering, not actually getting down to what you need to do. By the way, he did not, that picture there never happened because Nero wasn't in Rome when it caught fire. He was in Ostia. And in fact, even the historians admit that when the fire occurred, he made every effort to try to put it out, and he housed people who were made homeless in his own private property. He was also infamous for winning at the Olympics. He won several, I was going to say gold medals, but they didn't have gold medals. He won several events at the Olympics, including a 10-horse chariot race that he didn't finish because he fell off his chariot. However, the judges, because it's the emperor competing, awarded him the championship because if he had not fallen off his horse, he surely would have won. Therefore, he deserved to win. He's also infamous for being the last of the Julio-Claudians. The reality about Nero is that he shows really no interest in governance. He's kind of like a throwback to Tiberius. Tiberius wasn't interested in being the emperor because he wanted to retire. He didn't like being in Rome. He didn't like to have these relationships with senatorial ranked individuals. Nero had other interests. His interest was in singing and in acting. We don't think of that as horrific, right? Bill Clinton goes on the Tonight Show and plays the saxophone, and we think, wow, he's cool. For the Romans, however, singing and acting in public is something that ex-slaves and slaves do. It is so far beneath you socially that it is unacceptable. And that is what they found completely, infradig is the Latin term for it, beneath his dignity. Anyway, eventually the army becomes sufficiently disenchanted with Nero that there's a coup that builds up in one of the provinces. Nero's reaction to it, even though the Senate supports him, is to feel that he is losing his grip and that he is pushed to committing suicide. I'm going to spend a few slides on this because it is it is a major transition point from having an inherited position as the leader of Rome to completely breaking with that. It starts with Gaius Julius Vindex, who is the governor of Gaul. He was actually fairly easily defeated, but the governor who defeated him, it was another governor. It wasn't like Nero went out to the field to defeat Vindex. It was another governor from a neighboring province named Galba. And then he was encouraged to put himself forward as emperor. When that happened, the Senate declared Galba a public enemy. He's a hostis, which means it's like if you see him and you're loyal to Rome, you'll kill him. Sort of execute him on the spot. So at this point, Nero has the backing of the Senate. However, the Praetorian Guard actually came out in favor of Galba. That freaked out Nero far more than the support of the Senate bolstered him. He's probably looking back at the days of when Claudius became the emperor. Right? The Senate wasn't sure about it, but the Praetorian Guard was, and guess who won that debate? Anyway, the Senate flipped pretty quickly, and they decided, you know what? We're going to go with the Praetorian Guard on this one. They proclaimed Nero a public enemy. Nero's dying words, which you think about the dying utterances, they really capture a person's true feelings, right? You're not going to try to make something up as you're dying. And he says, what an artist the world is losing. So this is it. He always thought of himself as a performer, as a singer first, and as a ruler second. And so he committed suicide. He actually couldn't quite bring himself to commit suicide. He had his private secretary run him through But this is an interesting one because when he died, you had people who loved him, who thought he was wonderful. Here's an artist who has created a cameo, and it is Nero. He's holding Winged Victory on his hands. It is actually his apotheosis. It is an image of Nero becoming a god. So the person who created this piece of jewelry, and I'm sure it's not just the only one that was made in the entire Roman Empire. The person who created this piece of jewelry genuinely thought that Nero should be remembered as a god, that he should be deified, that he was a great emperor, and that it was a tragic thing that he was killed. It's not how That's not how the historical record worked. It's certainly not how the Senate thought. But you did have that's kind of shows you that there was a lot of pro-Neronians out there in the emperor. Anyway, the summing up of the Julio-Claudians before we get to the Civil War is that after over 90 years of members of the Julio-Claudians, we suddenly have that cut off, and we have the chaos of a civil war for most of 69 CE. Again, this now where we've experienced 69 and we get a description of it, which we're about to do. And then we look back and we think about how Claudius, after an assassination, after a sudden death, one day, it's even more stark. Anyway, the Julio-Claudian legacy. After over 90 years, the Roman world, and particularly the senatorial class, pretty much had accepted now that there was going to be a princeps. There was going to be a leader. There was not going to be rule by the Senate, rule by 2 consuls and 20 praetors, that kind of thing. That was gone. It is now one person in charge of everything. And we've talked about this before, this goes back to Marius, about the army having someone to look out for their interests. They are very heavily invested in there being an emperor because they have the stability of their pay, their pension. They know that they can look to that person. And so you have a mutual benefit here that their future is secured, and they can secure the future of the emperor. Another legacy is that the people in Rome were catered to. It's that bread and circuses stereotype. But because the Praetorians are the local army, because the Senate still has the authority to proclaim someone an emperor, to give them the constitutional roles, right? The title of chief priest, the title of tribunician power. But those two bodies are very influenced by what the people think. And so that has to be taken into account. The people are not electing anyone, they're not voting for anyone, but they still can show their support. It's almost like the court of public opinion. And the final legacy? Yeah, the final legacy is that the Senate has accepted their role now as advisors. They have influence. You still have kind of an oligarchical council, which, if you have a good emperor, will listen to that group of advisors in the Senate. But they don't have the power that they once had. Once we get over some bumps that we're going to talk about, that model of one-man rule with an advising Senate is going to create a stable government for a surprisingly long period of time. Anyway, before we get to stable government for a long period of time, we have to have a civil war. And I just want to briefly talk about that. These are the 4 individuals who stepped forward after, actually even before Nero committed suicide, um, to put their case forward to be the emperor, Servius Sulpicius Galba. And you can see, okay, yes, he is born before in the BCE period. Um, so he's definitely an older member of this quartet. Marcus Salvius Otho, young, Aulus Vitellius, and then finally you have Vespasian. You notice that they are all senatorial ranked. They are all governors of provinces. Vespasian isn't shown as being a governor of Judea, but he had been a governor before this, and he was actually out in Judea on a sort of a special assignment to support the governor there. So they all have that ranking. They all had troops behind them, which is the important part. You can see acclaimed by troops, acclaimed by the Praetorians, acclaimed by troops. Here we've got acclaimed by the prefect of Egypt, but he's got troops. Did I say troops matter? Anyway, this map kind of gives us an idea of where people's power bases are. Galba is governor in Spain. Otho is actually governor in Spain as well. Vitellius is the governor in Gaul, and Vespasian is out in Jerusalem. Again, without any succession, they are put forward. The way it's described is they are put forward by their armies, and then they accept that. It makes them sound a bit passive. I think that they had organized things a little more than that. In each case, they are not proclaimed as princeps. They are proclaimed as imperator, which doesn't mean emperor. It means conquering general. So the troops identify the leader of the Roman thing as a general first, and particularly as a successful general. Anyway, it all started in 67. And I've just showing people here, we've got Vespasian in Judea, Vitellius in Lower Germany, Otho in Lusitania, which is Portugal, technically. Galba's in Spain. And we also have another player in this drama, and that's Nymphidius Sabinus, who is the commander of the Praetorian Guard. Again, he's the one who's got troops that are sitting right beside the senators. The others have troops, but they're nowhere near the Senate. You also have a character named Rufus in Lower Germany, and Vindex in Gaul. Anyway, it starts with Vindex. So I've got this up there. You can see where everybody is in the Roman Empire in 67. Vindex led a rebellion. Mentioned him already. He tried to get other governors that were nearby to join him. Only Galba joined him. Virginius Rufus in Upper Germany marched against Vindex and actually defeated him in battle. So it's one thing to have troop support to become an emperor, but then you actually have to be successful when you lead those troops. Vindex was actually killed in battle, and that was him out of the picture. Virginius Rufus's troops tried to proclaim him as emperor, and he declined. We don't know the story behind it. We just know that he declined that. When Nero committed suicide in 68, Galba put himself forward. At first, the Senate declared him an enemy of the state, and then very soon afterwards declared him as princeps. So that's why he gets to be in the list, because he was officially proclaimed as princeps. Vindex undoubtedly proclaimed himself as imperator and princeps, but the Senate never acknowledged that. Um, so at this point, Galba marches to Rome, and he marches with Otho, who at this point is a supporter of Galba. Now, as a matter of fact, even though Nero had committed suicide, a legion had been organized before, sort of just before he died or even after he died. And they stood up against Galba and Otho. Um, but they defeated that legion. The other person who stood up against them was Nymphidius Sabinus, who was the head of the Praetorian prefect. The Praetorian Guard. He's the prefect of the Praetorian Guard. We don't know exactly what was going on here, whether Nymphidius Sabinus had another candidate in mind, whether he was supporting the Senate, but the Guard was not in favor of what their leader wanted, and so he was killed. And we now had Galba as the princeps. But not everybody was on board with that. Vitellius's troops way up in Germany did not go along with that. Also, Galba was not popular. He did not work to make himself popular with the Senate or with the people or even with his own troops. He was old guard. He was quite harsh. And so, as you can see, January the 15th, very early on in 69, he was assassinated. And his supporter, Otho, was proclaimed the emperor. So now we're down to 4. Otho learned of Vitellius's advance and that Vitellius was making his way down towards Rome. Otho marched forward to meet him, and you can imagine at this point here, it's like the winner becomes the imperator. Vitellius won this battle. Otho committed suicide, and the story is that he actually did this sort of selflessly to prevent a prolonged civil war and concede to Vitellius. So you can see here the civil war is kind of being protracted because the person who's proclaiming themselves as emperor keeps losing the battles. First of all, it was Vindex losing. Then it was the Praetorian prefect. We have Galba. Galba's assassinated. Now Otho's in charge, but Otho loses to Vitellius. Vitellius marches into Rome with his victorious legions, and the Senate proclaim him officially as the princeps, and that's why he makes the list. So he enters Rome. However, there are still troops out east, and out in the east, Vespasian was declared and proclaimed emperor. Vespasian sent his armies westward. He did not go himself, interestingly enough, but he sent his armies. There was a huge battle. It took place right in Rome, which again is one of these things that's kind of culturally shocking for the Romans. And Vitellius lost. Not many people left standing. We're just recalling this, that Otho was killed, then Vitellius was killed, and Vespasian kind of is the last man standing of all of the provincial governors who had enough troops to push forward a claim. Interesting selection of coins here. You're looking at these, and if you look at them, you realize that they've all got something odd on them, some sort of a stamp or whatever, and they're called counter stamps. And basically what it is somebody's produced a coin, they are removed from the political scene, and so their successor stamps the coin to identify the coin as being under their rule and kind of to try to negate the individual before them. So for instance, here is a Neronian coin, which has been stamped with an X by Vindex to show that, because the coin is still valuable, but now it's a Vindex coin. It's not a Nero coin. Here we have a Nero coin that is stamped by Galba in Latin, and it's noted that the counterstamps that Galba used, he made a point of not defacing Nero's face. He's avoided doing that. There's a Neronian coin that is counterstamped with Vespasian. It's not a surprise because you would have, Nero was the emperor for 14 years. It's a lot of time to have a lot of coins out there in circulation. And rather than bringing them in and melting them down and then re-stamping them, which is a lot of work, you can just put that counter stamp on them and do a little bit of proclaiming for yourself. So Vespasian's troops defeat Vitellius's troops, and we now have Vespasian as the final one, and he stays around for a while. Couple of things just to sum up. Galba is the first person to be proclaimed emperor without having any connection whatsoever to the family or to the family fortune. Right? Claudius may not have been an heir to Caligula, but at least he was still in the family. Galba has nothing to do with the family. So now we are seeing that this has stopped being a family-focused thing, a Julius Caesar or Tiberius Claudius family thing. It is now whoever can bring the best army and the most successful army to the party gets to be in charge of the party. Vespasian is the first, I'm going to call him stable emperor, who is unrelated to the Julio-Claudians. And one last little thing, just to sum up this lecture, is the Julio family fortune, which during the time of the Julio-Claudians was a major factor in making a person the princeps. Because you've got that fortune, you're in charge of that family estate, kind of have to be the emperor. And I certainly also talked about how Augustus blurred his estate with state funds by using a lot of his money to pay for state expenses. This now kind of rotates around 180 degrees. It's not the job comes with the estate. It is now the estate comes with the job. This is no longer the family estate of the Julio-Claudian family. This is now the possession of whoever is proclaimed princeps by the Senate, whoever gets all those lovely titles of chief priest and with tribunician power, imperator so many times. That person automatically gets control of the estate, the family estate. It's not really a family estate anymore. It's now, I guess it comes with the job. So the Julio-Claudian fortune now becomes the state's fortune, and it goes to the one who's got the best army and senatorial support. So we have now transitioned from a republic to a Julio-Claudian Principate. Now we have an open season on the Principate. And that's the way it's now going to be really up until 476, when the West breaks apart. In the Byzantine world, it's going to continue on for over a millennium, up until 1435. So a new world order, and one that's going to last for a very long time. Anyway, thank you so much. Glad you stayed with it right to the end, if you did. And I will bring it to a close now. So see you in 69 AD.